So let's jump into kind of the big picture contour of what's going on in Book One of Confessions. I posted about this, and I'll just draw your attention back to it. But in Book One, there's basically three parts to it. So there's a prelude where Augustine introduces Book One. He's really introducing the whole of the Confessions. Then he spends some amount of time talking about infancy. This is, of course, not an infancy that he can recall. He's very clear about this. He says, look, this isn't coming from my memory. This is coming from nurses. This is coming from my own observations of infants. This is coming from my own kind of pondering of what I observe in their behavior. He's not claiming that he has memories of his own infancy, but he deals with infancy, and he's got a meditation on this that some people just kind of cruise right by and are fine with, and other people find highly problematic. So maybe we'll take a straw poll here and see where everybody in the room landed on that. But people definitely have a reaction to this. But most of Book One is Augustine talking about his boyhood and talking about the first two stages of his education. So with the prelude, with this reflection on infancy, with the experience of boyhood, which has a lot of color to it, what's Augustine actually doing? We can stop for a second and say, okay, but what's the point? Like, why go back and start from an infancy you don't remember? Why all the discussion about what it was like being a kid and how you went to school and all of these various things? Like, what are you doing in this exercise? Well, this is what I think Augustine's doing. I think he's doing three things, really. The first thing that I think Augustine is doing is redeeming the time. Let me explain what I mean by this. Incidentally, the notes to all this that I'm working from, I'm happy to make available. So if I'm talking faster than you can write, don't worry about it. I would be happy to post this if that would be useful to you. But what Augustine is doing is he's redeeming the time. So we know something. We know that the spiritual history of a person undergoes a lot of change. There's changes of momentum, there's changes of orientation, there's a basic contour or flight path to someone's life. Sometimes there are sudden leaps forward. Sometimes there are returns to the past. All these various moments, nonetheless, are part of the basic continuity of a person, the basic continuity of a personality, which is gradually being constructed. Importantly, for our purpose, in the experience of any person, traces of the past always remain detectable, even when this past is denied. But for Augustine, this is what we want to land on. It's not a question of forgetting or destroying. It's a question of repairing. Not only repairing by doing better after having regained rectitude, but also by taking up the past to relive it in some way and give it a new meaning. This is what Augustine's doing in the Confessions. This is why he goes back to infancy. This is why he goes back to the very painful experiences of boyhood. He wants to take this up, relive it, give it a new meaning. And so this becomes, in a certain sense, and this is echoing the language of St. Paul in Ephesians, Augustine's redeeming the time. He's finding it again in order to save what he feels like he had lost. Confessions then is a redemption which assumes life in its totality. So when we hear the passage from Ephesians, redeem the time for the days are evil. This is St. Paul's admonition. I think it's Ephesians 5. Okay, well, we all think of that in a certain way immediately, which is, redeem the time. Like the time I have right now, I've got to be a good steward of my time, got to not waste time, I've got to not procrastinate. Okay, that's fine. But there's another nuance to this, which is another way of redeeming the time, which is looking back at life and saying, I don't want to forget, even though it was painful. I don't want to destroy. I want to take this back up again, and I want to see it through the lens of God's grace. I want to do something constructive. I want to redeem this time that I've already experienced, not redeem the time that's coming to me. First thing. I think what Augustine is doing in the second place is by doing this, he's instructing us and he's teaching us that you too can redeem the time. And so I think this puts us in contact with our first and maybe our most basic notion of Augustinian or confessional spirituality. This is something that we can imitate. We too can take back up and relive and reinterpret and reenact and redeem our past when we confess it in the light of God's grace. I think this is a legitimate spiritual exercise. I think this is something that someone could sit down and do and actually begin rehearsing. I mean, maybe we don't, draw conclusions about infancy from what other people have told us or what we've learned in books about child psychology, but maybe we do go back and take up the events earlier in our life and try to reimagine them or relive them from the perspective of God's grace. And thirdly, I think what Augustine is trying to do in book one is he's trying to stir us. He's trying to stir us. So Augustine, yes, this is his confession. It's this very, very long prayer in 13 books. But Augustine remains a pastor. He remains a doctor of the church. He's trying to guide. He's trying to teach. And I think he succeeds in a very concrete way by taking up the occasion of the events of his own life and the lives of the other characters who intervene in his own story. But he does this discreetly. He does this without overemphasizing the lesson. He's trying to tell the story in a way that resonates so that his reflections about the people and the places and the time that he lived arouse a similar sort of response in the reader. So I think that's what's going on at that level in book one. So in general, though, how is Augustine describing his early life? What is he saying? Well, I like threes. Augustine liked threes. Things in triads, people tend to remember. It also makes it easy to frame a discussion. But I think there's three things Augustine's saying in book one. One of the things that comes out clearly, we're going to find this thread picked up throughout the Confessions, is Augustine is very explicit about the Christian influence of his home. And this comes back to Monica. Almost an entire book of the Confessions is dedicated to her. But there's a lot of clues that he's dropping for us that this is the basic milieu he's coming out of. Augustine is not a converted pagan. He never claims that. No one would suggest that. Augustine is definitely coming from a Christian home, even though his father Patrick did not actually get baptized and enter into full communion with the church until basically he was about ready to die. This was when Augustine was about 16 years old. Augustine had the positive example of Monica, and he will relate and rehearse the things that he heard as a child. Now, his theological development was, of course, pretty basic, and it did leave him exposed to the possibility of other errors. But he's coming out of he breathes Christian air. That's the point that we want to make, because I think that's the point that he's making. That's the first thing. The second point that Augustine wants to make, I think, is that the basic result of the fall, and there's a lot of ways we could fill in the blank on this, but the basic result of the fall is that our affections are disordered. I think everybody can agree. Okay, I can live with that. And for Augustine, this is apparent even in a small child, in the expression in a small child of resentment, bitterness, spite, and really the incomprehension of adults. This is the world that Augustine's trying to describe and say, look, we'll get into the question of whether that actually means real guilt or not. The Catechism would not let us say that today. But he is saying, look, there's a disordered nature. This isn't what it should look like. Something has gone wrong. And then after he moves beyond infancy, and infans actually literally in Latin means a non-speaker. So when he moves out of infancy and becomes a speaker, this is the transitional moment. But this exposes him to a whole new harmful network of influences that he encounters at school. So having said that, we've got our kind of recalibration to antiquity. We've got our big picture contour of what's going in. So what I would propose to do here in just a couple minutes to make sure that there's time for questions is to touch on really the big highlights of these 31 sections. So I'll move quickly. I'm not going to be able to hit on everything even that I had hoped for or planned. But let's jump in here. So if you've got your text of the Confessions handy, you might want to leaf through. You certainly don't need to. You're welcome just to listen as I roll through. But let me point out a couple of the things that are highlights in book one. Okay, so from the word go, we're dealing with a book that's entitled The Confessions. This shows up on page 1 of the edition that I'm working from, and people tend to say, oh, Confessions, and they kind of gloss over that and keep moving. I talked about this briefly last time, but it's worth repeating. Pretty much in no stage of the history of the Latin language did confessio mean what Augustine means when he says this. Well, this is important because his notion of confession comes explicitly from the Latin Bible. And in particular, this comes directly out of the Psalms. So when Augustine says the title of this work is The Confessions, what he's signaling to us is that the Psalms is the book that taught Augustine how to pray in a confessional form. And it's also the book that provides him the vocabulary to do so. Augustine is going to quote scripture a shocking number of times. In the 13 books of the Confessions, I count 1,349 scriptural references or quotations or allusions. About 475 of those come from the Psalms. Now, if you want to compare this, Augustine quotes from classical authors only about 40 times in the Confessions. So 1,349 to 40. So in terms of the language that he's using, this is derived from scripture. I would be remiss at 1:1, so I'm just going to kind of give you the section number, tell you what I see here we can talk about. This is the most quotable phrase in the Confessions. I mean, if you're regularly attending Mass or church and hear a homily, probably once a year, somebody's going to get up and say, our heart is restless until it rests in you. Augustine says this. Everybody's heard this. So there are two like most quotable passages in the Confessions. You don't get very far in book one before you find the first of these. Let's jump on to so 2:2. I'll point this out. So 2:2, this is 2:2 and 3:3. Augustine's really kind of working out what I would call the paradox of invocation. We can be helped here because at some level it's like I'm not, even after the first 2, 3, 4 times I read this, I still feel like I'm not exactly sure where he's going with some of this. But actually, if we understand what's going on in the text underneath, it's helpful because invocare, which is the word that Augustine's using repeatedly in 1:2:2, it has a twofold meaning. And this is a play on words, actually. Invocare is just to invoke, to pray, a word we would all use. But invocare actually also means to call into. And so to make sense of what's going on in 2:2 and 3:3, we've got to catch that Augustine's playing on the word. There's wordplay involved. Invocare, to pray, invoke, invocare, to call into oneself. So if we see that can help to smooth out some of the difficulties in these first couple sections. The other thing I would point out, most editions do a pretty good job of identifying scriptural quotations, but the beginning of 2:2, Augustine makes a comment, or he drops the phrase, the God who created heaven and earth. Most people are surprised to learn that is actually the most quoted scriptural phrase in the Confessions. Of all the things that are quoted, the God who made heaven and earth. He quotes this over and over and over again. And actually, in Augustine's life, he would produce some sort of exegetical work on the book of Genesis on 6 different occasions. So getting back to the beginning, getting back to Genesis is very much a part of Augustine's outlook. Jumping ahead to 4:4. There's something, it's not going to be easy for me to share my screen and show you this, but I'll post it if anybody's interested in looking at it tomorrow. There's been really good scholarship on this early section done by French scholars who I think have proved pretty convincingly that this section 4:4 can actually be organized in stanzas as a poem. And so I've got a version of that I can post tomorrow if someone wants to see it. I actually find reading it as a poem in 7 stanzas makes a lot more sense than just reading it in the straight prose of 2 paragraphs in the Bolding translation, but I will submit that to the group to have a look at and see if you feel the same way. There's so much packed into 4:4, but I've got to keep moving and really only say this. Augustine uses a very curious phrase at the end of 4:4. And he closes this out. He says, "And what have we said, my God, my life, my holy sweetness?" Okay, this is a distinctively Augustinian phrase. God is holy sweetness. This is actually not scriptural language, because if you go to the Psalms and if you concordance this or you word search this, you look for what is sweet in the Psalms. This is never a form of direct address to God. If you go to Psalm 119, for instance, you can see the psalmist saying, "How sweet to my tongue is your promise, sweeter than honey to my mouth." Psalm 119, of course, is all about the word of God. But the idea of addressing God as holy sweetness, this actually, in a certain way, he's actually elevating the scriptural language and making this even more evangelical and more personal and more passionate. And so there are instances actually where Augustine will go beyond the language of scripture in his effort to be able to say something about the pursuit of God. I'm going to go ahead and just jump to 7:11. So that kind of wraps up quick tour of the prelude. So sins of infancy. Yeah, so this is the sort of passage that if we go back and read and reread, this is probably sort of passage that should drive all of us into the catechism to say, oh, okay, so what's Augustine on about here? And what should I really believe about the sinfulness of the infant? And you can never plug it enough, but the Augustine Encyclopedia by Alan Fitzgerald. I mean, if you need to look up original sin or any of these, you'll get all of the information you've ever wanted about how Augustine developed this idea. So the typical thing is to come to this and say, oh, okay, well, here's Augustine again, banging the drum of original sin, and he's picking on infants in order to do that. And it's kind of true, maybe kind of not true. I think the point that Augustine's trying to make, remembering that he's a professional rhetorician and he is prone to hyperbole, he is prone to rhetorical exaggeration. I think the point that he's making is if you look at any stage of life, you can find that human beings experience disordered affections. Now, Augustine's going to go so far as to say, yeah, but it's not in the limbs. It's not just those little hands and feet. It's actually the soul of the infant. And if we pick up the catechism and say, I'm not sure how I feel about this, we're, of course, reminded that, yes, there's the guilt of original sin, but I think people see this and like, okay, well, Augustine's basically saying infants are guilty of actual sin. And I think he is, yes, he is kind of saying this. The Catechism does not say this, because in order to have guilt, what do you need? Well, you need full consent and you need freedom and rational deliberation. The infant doesn't have any of these things. And so, best we can take out of this, okay, Augustine has detected something. He sees disordered affections, but this does not actually incur real guilt. Jumping then ahead, I do want to make sure we have at least 20 minutes for questions, which we're coming up on. The turning point in the book, though, is 813. So we've had the prelude, we've had Augustine's discussion of infancy, which he confesses he doesn't actually remember. And I think I'll say this, I think the last thing that he says at the end of 712 is instructive. He says, look, it literally says, but look, I got to set this aside. I have to set this time of life aside. And what does it even matter today when not a single trace of this still resides in my memory? So that might be him, kind of giving us the out on this. But at 813, we really find the turning point of the book. I'm sorry, of chapter one. I'm sorry, book one, is the issue of language acquisition. As I mentioned in something that I posted online, there's a lot of ways that even 20th century philosophers of language have picked this up and done interesting things with it. But for our purposes, what Augustine is trying to tell us, and this will become important when we get to book 10, is that actual memory for him begins with learning to speak. This is the critical element. And he literally says this in 813. He says, and I remember this. I remember what it was to learn to speak. So for Augustine, language acquisition marks the beginning of memory. Language acquisition also marks the entrance into human society. And this is where the guilt of actual sin is beyond all question in Augustine's mind. At 914, he begins in not happy fashion to tell us how wretched he was as a little boy at school. Basically, he summarizes his school experience in 6 things. He says, the people who taught me had the wrong aim, which is get wealthy, get really good at speaking and get wealthy. This was the aim of my education. He said it was miserable because adults were incomprehensible to me. I didn't know why I was here. I didn't know why I was being told these things. It was miserable because it was received under compulsion. But any 7-year-old in the Roman Empire would have been compelled to something. Children were not luxuries in the ancient world. A child went either directly into work on the farm or the family business, or a child went directly into school at age 7. Children assumed their adult roles much, much earlier than they do in modern societies. The other thing that Augustine experienced, which is well attested in ancient education, is the beatings that he received and the feeling of resentment and fear that this inspired in him. And Augustine looks at all of this, he attributes it to something. So the same thing he attributed to the disorder of the infant. This is a result of the fall. All of this is all fallen human nature at work. But in the midst of this fallen human nature, he does have a Christian encounter. So again, Augustine's coming back to, yes, I'm subjected to this education that I didn't ask for, that I didn't understand as a child, that's going to expose me to all sorts of immoral ideas, but I'm still basically working from this stream of a Christian consciousness. Some of this, in the interest of time, I apologize, I'm just going to have to skip over. I will draw attention to one last thing and stop here. I'm jumping all the way out to 1828, passing over a lot of the experiences he talks about as a schoolboy, because I do want to draw attention to this image at 1828, which is really kind of the archetypal image of the Confessions. So at 1828, Augustine gives a little description, a little discourse on the prodigal son. And this, for Augustine, is the image of the human soul. This is probably the most powerful image that he comes back to time and time again. But there's actually another image going on here as well that Augustine fuses. What's obvious is that he's quoting from Luke 15. This is pretty transparent. What's not as obvious is that in the same passage, he's weaving in a reference from Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, from the Aeneas, which is just a philosophical discussion, and this was from the philosophical discussion on beauty. This is the same idea. What he finds in Plotinus was this idea that Ulysses, or Odysseus, right, from the Odyssey, had become, for ancient thinkers, and this is broadly, but specifically for Christians who were informed by Neoplatonism, this image of Odysseus trying to get back home, because that's the whole story of the Odyssey, right? Trojan War's over. Odysseus is trying to get home. It takes him 10 years. He goes through all these trials and struggles to get there. This becomes another portrait of the human soul trying to make its way back to the homeland, trying to make its way back to God. And so it is interesting. It is instructive that in the first book of Confessions, Augustine is using the image of the prodigal son and the image of Odysseus as the lost sailor who's trying to get back to the homeland. So in the interest of questions, I'm going to stop there, and we'll simply have to apologize for parts of this that I was not able to get to.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. This is Jim again, and a couple things. Anyone who has questions, please put them into chat, or if easier, if at the bottom of the screen, there's a reactions icon. You can hit that. There's a raise hand. Raise your hand. We'll be able to get to a question that way. I'd like to kick off with two that I have, Kevin. One is, I don't know, maybe well, you can figure out how to categorize the two. I'll ask them both at once, and then I may even have a third. But the first one I have is right out of the gate. The most famous quote from Confessions, one of the most famous quotes in Christian literature. Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. I've heard that translated as singular as well, our heart. And I'm curious if you have as well, and if there is a more accepted translation, because there is a huge difference, I think. Our hearts collectively, or we as one body of Christians. Our collective heart is restless, and then also, pretty much up front in book one, obviously, chapter 2, where he says, since nothing that is could exist without you, you must in some way be in all that is, therefore also in me.
You're muted, James.
Thank you. Man, I was asking a brilliant question. So I will restart and try and be more brief. For anyone that has questions, you can put them in chat or just raise your hand. At the bottom of the screen, there's in the reactions tab, there's an ability to raise hand. The two questions that I had, Kevin, are Number one, in right out of the gate, the most famous quote, "Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." I've heard that translated with hearts as singular, our heart. It's kind of a different take on it, I think, individually versus collectively as a body of Christians. And so I'm curious if there's a more accepted translation for, is it a plural or is it a singular? And what implications that might have for Augustine's thinking, or maybe I'm overthinking that. And then secondly, it's still book 1, chapter 2. He says, "Yet since nothing that is could exist without you, you must in some way be in all that is, therefore also in me." And that's, I think, a huge theological concept. I know that, St. Paul heavily influenced Augustine, St. Augustine heavily influenced Aquinas, and many others that, are ultimately what we read today in the Catechism. Maybe if you could say, like, was that Augustine's original thought? Like was he the guy who kind of grasped that, or was he reflecting on Psalms or Paul or something else, and just articulating that in his own words? And now you're muted, Kevin.
Right. Okay. So for the first question, yeah. So a literal reading of the Latin would be this: "And our heart," I mean, it's plural, nostrum ars, cor singular, "and our heart is unquiet until it is made quiet or becomes quiet in you." That's a hyper literal reading, but the point of the cor nostrum is, yeah, I would probably view this something like a poetic singular. Our heart. I mean, there almost might be a little bit of oxymoron there. So this could, in a sense, be Augustine even signaling that he is the everyman, like it is our heart, and he is the representative of the human quest for God's grace and the vision of God. Honestly, I don't know if I'd ever thought about it being in the singular, so I'm going to have to, that's going to be homework for me for the next couple weeks to dig in. It is certainly intentional. I would tend to think it's probably more poetic, but there certainly could be something theological going on there. It's a really good observation. But yes, to be clear, in the Latin, it is cor, the heart is singular, and the nostrum is like pater noster, our Father. This is cor nostrum, our heart. And then the second question about God being in all things, well, I think Augustine probably did the best job of rendering this poetically in 2:2 and 3:3. This might trace its roots back to Paul's sermon at the Areopagus, where he's talking to the Epicureans and the Stoics, and he makes the argument, well, in God we live and move and have our being, right? I think that probably is a starting point for Augustine's reflection on this. So I'm not sure that he would have been the first, but I think what he does with it in 2:2 is probably the most original.
I have a few more questions in the chat, Kevin. If marriages were arranged, why was Monica married to a non-Christian?
Yes, well, I suppose this is probably because at the time, in North African Christianity, this may not have been felt to be a mandate. I mean, this arranged marriage, well, yeah, I think there's a few pieces to this. Arranged marriages at this point may not have been able to fully calculate for a spiritually mixed marriage. This is a pretty highly transitional time. There's also the possibility that her parents just, frankly, maybe weren't that devout, and this was a marriage of advantage or convenience, and religious difference wasn't something that anyone viewed as particularly an obstacle. There's probably been a fair amount of study on this, but I think in this period in late antiquity, you probably had a fair number of spiritually mixed marriages, because paganism is still holding on, even after Constantine, even after Nicaea, even after the Altar of Victory controversy. You still have part of the aristocracy who's clinging to this, and you have families who are mixed as well. mixes of Christian and pagan. So I guess I would chalk it up to that, one of those reasons. But it should not be assumed that people in the upper class who were Christians necessarily were always arranged with a Christian partner.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kevin. Another question. You mentioned three things that book one can be summed up in. The first, Augustine speaks from Christian foundation. The second, we have a cracked nature. And what is number three? As I think I missed it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So 3 points. The general Christian influence at home, the Christian air that he breathes. I mean, this is the milieu he's coming out of. The second is, yeah, cracked nature. The disordered affections appear as early as in the infant, even if they're not contracting real guilt. And then the third point is that as soon as he learns to speak, he is thrust into this new harmful network of influences that he discovers at school. So Christian home, cracked nature, the mixed blessing of being sent to school, but largely the emphasis on the harmful aspects of it.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Augustine's account of his boyhood, can it be read as one's rite of passage towards attaining grace?
Yes, I would go so far as to say that the whole of the first 9 books are this journey, this rite of passage to obtaining to the point of grace and coming into full communion with Christ and with the church. That seems to be what he's doing, because he's actually, as this unfolds over the 9 books, he's going to actually work right through how people in antiquity would have thought about the stages of life. So there's infancy, the non-speaker, and then there is the radical transition when one begins to speak into boyhood. And then this gives way to adolescence, which is not how we think about it today. The word, well, adolescencia, which is the Latin word, it actually means from about 16 to 30. And then you're a young man from 30 to 45, and then middle age and so on. But he's obviously going to cut off before he gets through all of the stages. But yes, I would say all of this, it is a passage. It's a passage through all of these stages to the final attainment of the grace of God.
Thank you, Kevin. The sentence that jumped out at me was, every disorder of the soul is its own punishment. The last sentence of chapter 7 or 12. If that's true, then perhaps the sacrament of reconciliation is redundant, serious/not serious. What would Augustine say?
Well, first of all, I agree with Jim O'Neill on this. Every disorder of the soul is its own punishment is one of the most striking. There's words for this. Do we call it an aphorism? Do we call it a zinger? Do we call it a Augustinian epigram or quotable quote? I tend to just use zinger because it's quick. But yeah, this is one of my favorite zingers in book 1 too. Every disorder of the soul is its own punishment. Actually, another way to render this is every disordered soul is its own punishment. This is actually important for a number of reasons. This is picked up by Aquinas for sure, but Augustine does tend to see punishment from God as a passive thing. Like, this is part of the effect of original sin. The disorder of the soul is the punishment of sin. So Augustine's view of punishment from a theological standpoint is I think massively passive. So kind of the idea of, the rather false idea of, God's always kind of up there in heaven looking down, seeing who he's going to, make bad things happen to because they've sinned so egregiously. This is, of course, a naive and childish notion, but people do tend this way. They tend to think of God as actively like managing the situation and inflicting people. This is not the Augustinian view. The Augustinian view is, no, it's passive. The disorder that comes from original sin is its punishment. This is the thing that we have to resolve. Perhaps the sacrament of reconciliation, interesting that you should bring this up, because the sacrament of reconciliation was actually still being worked out in Augustine's lifetime. A number of the sacraments had not attained to the form that we would recognize them in. And in North Africa in particular, this was a problem. When somebody sinned egregiously, and in North Africa in the time of the martyrs, the most egregious thing you could do would be to cooperate with persecutors, namely by handing over sacred books for them to burn. This is actually where we get the term traitor from. Traditore is literally to hand over. That's what it is. If you handed over the sacred books, you were a traditore, you were a traitor. You're someone who handed over something sacred under imperial persecution. This actually caused a major problem in the church in North Africa because the church didn't know what to do. Can these people be forgiven? Well, how? And what does penance look like? So the serious, not serious question is actually a very valid question, in that it helps to illuminate some of this was still getting sorted out. And it took a while before the church in North Africa and the church universally really figured out how to deal with public and egregious sin.
Thanks, Kevin. Augustine writes, were I to ask which loss would be more damaging to human life, the loss from men's memory of reading and writing, or the loss of these poetic imaginings, there can be no question what anyone would answer who had not lost his own memory. He seems to chastise himself for his interest in literature, and thinks the foundational education of language, etc., is more important. But doesn't the foundation allow us all to appreciate the beauty of literature?
Yeah, this is a fun and an interesting question. Yeah, that is what Augustine says. There's a bit of rhetorical effect to this, but he's basically arguing and saying, if I were to ask somebody which is more fundamental to their education and formation, the fact that they learned to read and write at all, or the fact that they learned from Terence's plays what it looks like for Zeus to commit adultery. Like where this is actually what he's arguing in this section. The point that Augustine is at pains to make in book 1, and this is the words that he uses. He said, I don't critique the words, they're choice vessels, but the problem is what was put into them for me to drink. This is the image that Augustine uses in this section. So there's a rhetorical element to this, but there is also this desire to distance himself from a classical learning that he was so imprinted by that he could never really escape it. So this is one of the interesting dilemmas of Augustine's personality, the way that he was formed in a truly classical education. People talk a lot about classical education today. Like Augustine really had a real classical education. He never stops quoting Terence his whole life. And I wish I would have had more time on this. I should have managed a little bit better. But he's actually very cleverly dropping pieces that he learned from Terence all throughout the section about his childhood. And in fact, the longest quote from any classical author in the whole of the Confessions is a quote from one of Terence's plays, which I think is pretty clear in the way that Boulding or Chadwick draw this out. So yeah, I think Augustine's conflicted on this. He's conflicted about the fact that he was exposed to so much baseness and immorality in the literature, but it's a literature that is so imprinted on him that he can't stop quoting it. And in fact, he does so in Confessions, maybe even unconsciously.
Another one in 7, I think it's 6, 7, I'm not sure here, when he says, I do not know whence I came to be in this mortal life, or as I may call it, this living death. Do you think he says this as being because of the fall, an original sin, as being the living death and part of a journey to be in the life in God's grace?
Yes, I do think that. I agree with that. And this is another one of those zingers. This is kind of a classic Augustinian saying, is this life, is this really a dying life or a living death? He's being rhetorical, he's being poetic. This is also something you find the same idea in Platonism, whether life is a living death or a dying life. But yes, I think all of these things that Augustine's using, he's not using to push forward a Platonist agenda. He is ultimately linking this to the journey of grace. But in this particular section, 6, 7, there's also something else going on here, which is, he doesn't get into it here, but he gets into it in some of his other writings, is Augustine was kind of mystified at the whole idea of where did I really come from? And of course, he traces his back. He talks about being in the womb of Monica. He's explicit about this on a couple of points. But the whole idea of where does the soul come from in the human person was a question that Augustine never felt like he could fully answer to his own satisfaction.
Okay, one last question here. At the time of this writing of the Confessions, was the canon put together for the church, and didn't Augustine help put it together?
Canon. Yeah, let me think about this. So you've got some kind of regional gatherings of bishops to answer the question of canon. There was an ecclesiastical meeting in Carthage or Hippo where the issue of the canon was dealt with, and Augustine would have, if he wasn't presiding at that, he would have been present at that. I would say it's probably safer to say that Augustine worked out of the canon that he had received. I don't know if Augustine really did anything to clarify the canon, but even if we just take the confessions as representative, there's not really much question about what he thought the canon was. I mean, for Augustine, the Septuagint was a virtually inspired translation of the Bible. And so if there's any book in the Septuagint, Augustine is using this. And in part, he's inheriting this as well, because in the controversy leading up to Nicaea, the deuterocanonical books, Ecclesiasticus, Sirach, Wisdom, all of these books are factoring very heavily into actually into Christological debate. We don't generally think of that as the place to go, but they did, and they had their reasons. It's not just in the Gospel of John. So he is working out of a canon that is, I mean, let's put it this way. When I was a Protestant reading the Confessions, I could not understand why he's quoting Ecclesiasticus and Sirach. Like, that didn't even compute for me. And the reason is because that was functionally the canon for him. That was never in question.
Those are all the questions in the chat, Kevin. Thank you.